So, talking about the language of heaven. As I said before, this is stimulated by a question that was posed. This one seems more like a statement than a question, but you'll see what I mean. You go with heaven speaking the same language as you speak here, not this thing of heavenly language. This is also unnecessary. There are all languages in heaven: English, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Japanese, all of them, and also the languages that are no longer spoken in earth anymore. So that's what we're responding to today. I've only really got opportunity just to sort of cover the main points and sort of the surface of this today. If you want to go any further, look into it more deeply, then I'd suggest you look at these 3 chapters in Heaven and Hell, because this deals directly with this issue of speech and language and writing in heaven. And the other place to look is the index to Heaven and Hell. So if you go to the back of your copy, Swedenborg himself has indexed the book. So if you look at the words idea and speech, you will come across some of the concepts we're going to deal with today and more. But I'm going to begin here. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I don't need to tell you what that picture is about for you to understand exactly what is going on, do I? Very, very clear what is happening there. And I wonder whether this is one of the closest experiences we can have to an angelic language. I want you to think about what happens when we speak. What we think happens is that I say something and you hear it and you understand me implicitly. But that is not what happens. What happens is I have a meaning that I wish to communicate to you. And in order to do that, I choose words which most closely represent, in my view, what I'm trying to communicate to you. You then hear those words and you take your understanding of those words and convert them back into a meaning. Is there any reason to suppose that you necessarily understand what I originally meant to say? There are so many points along that process where things could go wrong that very often we do not understand one another. And this leads us to all sorts of problems in the natural world. So I'm going to say that language, as we have it here, is basically inefficient. It cannot, with 100% accuracy, portray or communicate what it is I am trying to say. There is always an inefficiency about it. And that is even if I am saying what I actually intend. You know, often we say one thing, but we actually mean another. I'm forgetting about all of that kind of stuff that might go on. Pam borrowed a book from the library a couple of weeks ago, which she's read and she's now passed on to me, by an author by the name of Rainn Wilson. He's well known as an actor from the US version of the sitcom The Office. And the book is called Soul Boom. And this is what he says about language. How can one use a tool as deficient as language to attempt to express the inexpressible? It is merely the flitting of the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. It is a finger pointing at the moon. So, when we talk about our speech and we compare it with the speech of angels, one of the things we learn from Swedenborg's work is that our speech is relatively external. And this is what Swedenborg writes. Although the external or natural memory remains in man after death, the merely natural things in it are not reproduced in the other life. For this reason, the external or natural memory as to those things that are material is then quiescent, or put aside. And only those things that man has imbibed in the world by means of material things and has made rational come into use. So there are natural physical processes that go on in our lives from which we learn things, and it's the things that we learn that we take with us and remain with us. It's those natural physical processes which tend to be, as he says here, quiescent, put aside. The memory of them is still there and can be still accessed, but they are not, generally speaking, used. But then when we talk about angels' speech, he talks about their speech and language being more interior. And here's what he writes. Language in heaven is not learnt, but implanted by nature with everyone, for it flows from their very affection and thought. It is affection sounding and thought speaking. Now, it's tempting to think about that last phrase as very descriptive, but I actually think it's very accurate. Affection sounding and thought speaking. No longer do we have the communication through a natural process. We have communication in an internal form, from one person's thought, one person's affection, to another person's thought and affection. There's a direct connection there. And so, of course, the communication is more efficient because there's less loss on the way. Now, he talks about the way that angels and spirits speak with us, and you'll get a sense of what goes on here. When angels and spirits talk with us, it sounds just as audible as when we talk with each other. But it is not audible to people who are nearby, only to ourselves. This is because the speech of an angel or spirit flows first into our thought, and then by an inner route into our organ of hearing, so that it activates it from within. So there you get that picture of the communication taking place on a mental or spiritual level, and then it drops down into the physical level of hearing, stimulated from within, you see? And I wonder whether it's something like this that took place at Pentecost, that enabled so many people of different languages and nationalities to understand what it was the disciples were saying. The communication was an internal one, into their hearts and minds, and from there into their speech and their hearing. Now, because it's this internal route that is followed, angels' speech is more efficient. And so Swedenborg writes, "The speech of angels is full of wisdom because it proceeds from their interior thought, and their interior thought is wisdom, as their interior affection is love. Consequently, they can express in a single word what man cannot express in 1,000 words." That last sentence. There's a number of statements like this, the idea that something can be expressed in a single word by an angel, that it takes us 1,000 words to express. And he says something can be expressed in a moment by an angel. It would take us more than half an hour to express. Those sorts of ideas are quite common. The other thing to bear in mind that is angel speech is not limited to natural concepts. So much of the way we build our language is based on natural things, because that's the way that our mind works. It's tied to the natural world. Angels' minds are much more open to something much wider and broader, so their speech is not so limited in that way. And the other thing to bear in mind too is that angels cannot say what they don't mean and what they don't think. Spirits and angels speak from those affections and consequent thoughts that are of their minds, and are therefore unable to give expression to things that do not square with their affections and thoughts. So when it comes to an angel or a spirit speaking, there's no subterfuge. There's no I think one thing and I say another. If I don't like your hat, I'll tell you. And we think of that as a great virtue. The virtue of honesty, being an open book, being able to be seen so everybody can see the internal you. We do think of that as a virtue. But I also want to add another aspect to this which is very important and we need to consider. Angels are angels because of the presence of the Lord in their lives. Now notice this says spirits and angels, and I think this is the fundamental difference between them. We all, entering the spiritual world, become a spirit. So we all become that open book. But an angel has the Lord at their very core that is driving the whole process. And so what an angel speaks is not just honest, but it is based on goodness and truth and nothing else. And that's a very different quality from the kind of honesty that we turn into a virtue these days. And we need to remember this idea. An angel is an angel because the Lord is at the core of their very being. Heaven is heaven because of the presence of the Lord. This is the very beginning of the book, Heaven and Hell. The first couple of chapters establish that fact. And everything else we read in the book, we have to remember that fundamental principle. So I want to go to the passage from Zephaniah that Pam read for us this morning. For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord. And then a little further on, verse 13. The remnant of Israel shall do no unrighteousness and speak no lies, nor shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth. For they shall feed their flocks and lie down, and no one shall make them afraid. You see, the thing is, the purity of language that is established here comes from the purity within. If you remember the early part of that chapter, it was all doom and gloom, wasn't it? It was judgment, it was harsh. There were many things going wrong in the nation at the time as Zephaniah speaks to them. And it is a chapter of judgment, most definitely. But here at the end of, or towards the end of the chapter, there is this vision of hope. But the vision of hope is all based around the idea that it is the Lord present in our lives which re-establishes a new order. And that's what we need to hang on to. So when we think about ourselves, or we think about anybody being a people of pure language, well, it's because they say what they mean. They also say what they think, which is another level to it if you think about it. But then they also say what is in accordance with goodness and truth, and that's another level deeper again. So, what can we learn from all of this? First of all, as you listen to someone else speak, learn to listen for meaning, not just the words. And understand that this process is an inefficient one, and you will often make mistakes. The person that is speaking will often speak out of turn, they'll say the wrong thing, they'll express something badly, but patiently listen for meaning. When you speak, speak carefully and in such a way that your meaning is able to be received and heard by those who are listening. Understand that someone listening to you is very likely to get it wrong because the language you are using is inefficient, because the way I use a particular word is not necessarily the way you understand that word. But then lastly, remember that anyone can be honest, but does it accord with what is good and true? And that's the question we really ought to ask ourselves.